A young settler girl was tied to a railroad track with Traitor, branded into her flesh until a brave Sioux warrior cut her free and changed the course of two broken souls forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the endless expanse of Nebraska territory, its golden light catching the parallel lines of steel that stretched toward the distant horizon like twin rivers of destiny. The Union Pacific Railroad had carved its way through this land with the determination of progress itself, leaving behind a wake of displaced earth, broken promises, and the dreams of a nation hungry for connection. But on this particular morning, in late September of 1869, those gleaming rails would bear witness to something far darker than the promise of civilization. They would frame a scene of cruelty that would test the very foundations of mercy and redemption.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The air hung thick with the scent of prairie grass and distant smoke, carrying on its currents the faint whistle of an approaching locomotive still miles away. Birds that had once sung freely in these vast grasslands now scattered at the alien sound of progress, their cries lost in the growing rumble that seemed to make the very earth tremble with anticipation. It was here, at a remote section of track, where the railroad crossed through disputed territory, that the boundaries between civilization and wilderness blurred into something dangerous and unforgiving. Abigail Preston lay motionless between the steel rails, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already begun to chafe bloody welts into her pale skin. The 19-year-old daughter of a prominent railroad surveyor had become an unwilling symbol of the bitter conflicts that raged across these territories, conflicts between progress and tradition, between those who would tame the wilderness and those who called it home. Her long auburn hair, usually pinned neatly beneath a proper bonnet, now spread in tangled waves across the wooden crosties, matted with dust and dried blood from the wound on her temple. The word traitor had been burned into the tender flesh of her left shoulder with a branding iron, the letters still raw and weeping beneath the torn fabric of her once pristine blue dress. The smell of charred skin mingled with the metallic scent of the rails, creating an odor so nauseating that even the vultures circling overhead seemed to maintain their distance. Her accusers had been thorough in their condemnation, men from her own settlement who had discovered her secret meetings with Sioux representatives, her desperate attempts to broker peace in a land where peace seemed as impossible as stopping the sun from rising. The approaching train's whistle grew louder now, its mournful cry echoing across the plains like a death knell. Abby's eyes fluttered open, consciousness returning in waves of pain and confusion. The world swam before her vision, the endless blue sky above seeming to pulse with each labored heartbeat. She tried to move, tried to speak, but found her voice reduced to little more than a hoarse whisper that was immediately swallowed by the wind. The ropes at her wrists had been tied with the expertise of men who understood knots, men who had wanted to ensure that there would be no escape from this final judgment. Miles away from the nearest settlement, with nothing but rolling grassland and scattered buffalo bones to mark the landscape, this stretch of track had been chosen specifically for its isolation. No one would hear her screams, no one would witness her final moments, and by the time the train crew discovered what remained, her accusers would be long gone, their message delivered with brutal efficiency. The railroad that her father had helped survey, the symbol of progress and prosperity that had brought their family west in search of a better life, would become the instrument of her destruction. But the plains held secrets of their own, and not all eyes that watched these events belonged to those who sought vengeance. From a ridge nearly a quarter-mile away, hidden among the tall buffalo grass and scattered sagebrush, Mapia observed the scene below with the patience of a hunter and the heart of a warrior. The 25-year-old Sioux had been tracking the group of settlers for 2 days, following their trail from the burned remains of a peaceful encampment where 3 of his people had been murdered while trying to retrieve stolen horses. He had expected to find the perpetrators, perhaps to exact the kind of justice that his warrior training demanded. But what he discovered instead challenged every assumption he had made about the white settlers and their capacity for both cruelty and honor. Through the scope of a captured cavalry spyglass, Mapia had watched the entire brutal proceeding unfold. He had seen the young woman brought forward in chains, had witnessed the heated arguments among her captors, and had observed with growing fascination as she lifted her chin defiantly even as they pressed the burning brand to her flesh. Most surprisingly, he had recognized her face. This was the same woman who had appeared at the secret meetings near Willow Creek, the one who spoke halting Lakota and carried messages of peace from her father. She was the one they called the bridge builder, though it seemed her own people had decided that bridges were no longer welcome in this territory. The wind shifted, bringing with it the distant but unmistakable sound of the approaching locomotive. Mapia's jaw tightened as he calculated the time remaining, perhaps 20 minutes before the great iron horse would thunder past this spot, its massive weight making quick work of anything unfortunate enough to be in its path. The settlers who had tied her there were already mounting their horses, their deed done, their message delivered. They would ride back to their fortified town and speak of justice served, of traitors punished, never knowing that their actions had been witnessed by one whose own code of honor would not permit such cruelty to go unanswered. Rising silently from his hiding place, Mapia moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to walk these plains before he could properly hold a weapon. His buckskin clothing blended seamlessly with the autumn grasses, and his moccasined feet made no sound as he descended toward the railroad tracks. The war paint that adorned his face red ochre mixed with sacred clay marked him as a member of the Kit Fox Society, warriors bound by oath to protect the innocent regardless of tribal affiliation. It was an oath that had guided his actions in countless battles, and it would guide him now in what might prove to be the most important rescue of his life. The approaching train's whistle split the air again, closer now, urgent in its warning. Black smoke billowed from the locomotive stack, visible on the horizon like a storm cloud racing across clear sky. Mapia quickened his pace, his mind already calculating the precise timing required for what he planned to do. He carried only his knife and a tomahawk, having left his rifle hidden with his horse in a distant grove of cottonwoods. This would need to be accomplished with stealth and speed rather than force, for even the smallest delay could prove fatal. As he drew closer to the tracks, Mapia could see the full extent of the woman's injuries. The brand on her shoulder was worse than he had realized from a distance. The letters burned deep enough to scar permanently. Her dress, torn and stained with blood and dirt, told the story of rough handling and deliberate humiliation. But it was her eyes that captured his attention, most eyes that reflected not the empty stare of the defeated, but the fierce spark of someone who had not yet surrendered to despair. Even bound and helpless, even facing certain death, she possessed a quality that spoke to something deep within his warrior's heart. The train whistle sounded again, and this time Mapia could see the locomotive itself, still distant but growing larger with each passing second. The great machine moved with inexorable purpose, its iron wheels striking the rails in a rhythm that seemed to count down the final moments of Abigail Preston's life. Steam poured from its sides like the breath of some massive beast, and the ground beneath Mapia's feet began to vibrate with the approaching thunder of progress unleashed. Dropping to his knees beside the bound woman, Mapia drew his knife with practiced efficiency. The blade, forged from steel traded at Fort Laramie and honed to razor sharpness on river stones, gleamed in the morning sunlight. Abby's eyes widened as she saw him, fear and recognition warring in her expression. She knew who he was not by name, but by the distinctive markings that identified him as one of the Sioux warriors who had attended the peace meetings. Whether he had come to rescue her or to claim his own form of justice remained terrifyingly unclear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing rumble of the approaching train.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
If you're going to kill me, make it quick. Mapia silenced her with a gesture, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign that the departing settlers might return. Satisfied that they were truly alone, he turned his attention to the ropes that bound her wrists. The knots were complex, tied by someone who had wanted to ensure that even if she somehow freed one hand, the other would remain secured. It was the work of men who had planned for every contingency except the intervention of a Sioux warrior with a sharp knife and a code of honor that transcended tribal boundaries. The first rope parted under his blade with a soft whisper of severed fibers. Abby gasped as feeling returned to her hands, pins and needles of sensation that brought both relief and agony in equal measure. Mapia worked quickly but carefully, his movements economical and precise. The train was close enough now that individual cars could be distinguished behind the locomotive, close enough that the engineer would soon be able to see what lay ahead on the tracks. Every second counted. Every heartbeat brought them closer to a collision that would leave nothing but scattered remains and unanswered questions. Why? Abby managed to ask as he cut through the final binding, her voice stronger now that hope had returned. Why are you helping me? Mapia paused in his work, meeting her eyes with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had learned the language as a tool of survival rather than a birthright. Because honor does not see the color of skin, he said simply. And because you tried to build peace where others would only make war. The train whistle screamed its warning, now close enough that the engineer had spotted something on the tracks ahead. The great machine began to slow, but momentum and physics conspired against any hope of a gentle stop. Sparks flew from the wheels as the brake shoes pressed against steel, and the shriek of metal on metal added its voice to the locomotive's desperate whistle. Mapia sliced through the last rope and hauled Abby to her feet, her legs nearly buckling as circulation returned with painful intensity. Together, they stumbled away from the tracks, Mapia supporting her weight as she fought to regain control of her limbs. Behind them, the train thundered past in a display of power and noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The engineer leaned from his cab, scanning the area where he had seen figures moving. But by then, Mapia and Abby had reached the safety of a small depression hidden by tall grass. They lay there breathing heavily, hearts pounding from exertion and the nearness of death, as the last car of the train disappeared into the distance and silence reclaimed the prairie. For several minutes neither spoke, the weight of what had just transpired settling over them like dust after a stampede. Abby's hands trembled uncontrollably as she touched the branded flesh on her shoulder, wincing at the contact but needing to confirm that the nightmare was real. The pain served as an anchor to consciousness, preventing her mind from retreating into the merciful darkness of shock. Mapia remained perfectly still beside her, his warrior's training keeping him alert for any signs of pursuit, while his eyes never strayed far from the injured woman who had become his unexpected responsibility. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions, and the magnitude of what this rescue would mean for both their futures. In saving her life, Mapia had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had violated the unwritten rules of a conflict that painted all interactions between their peoples in shades of blood and revenge. His own tribe would view his actions as either noble or treasonous, depending on which voices held sway in the council fires. But as he watched Abby struggle to process her trauma while maintaining the dignity that had impressed him even from a distance, he felt no regret for his choice. Abby finally lifted her head, auburn hair falling across her face as she studied the man who had risked everything to save her life. Up close, she could see details that had been invisible during their brief encounters at the peace meetings. The intricate beadwork on his war shirt, The careful braiding of his hair with strips of red cloth and eagle feathers, the ceremonial. Scars on his arms that marked significant victories or spiritual visions. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Dark brown depths that seemed to carry the weight of ancient wisdom and recent sorrows in equal measure. The men who did. "This," she said quietly, her voice still hoarse from screaming during the branding. "They were from my own settlement. People I grew up with. People who sat at my father's table and called themselves our friends." The bitterness in her voice was as raw as her physical wounds, the betrayal cutting deeper than any iron could reach. "They said I was a traitor for trying to prevent more bloodshed, for believing that peace was possible between our peoples." Mapia nodded slowly, understanding more than she might have expected. "Among my people," he said carefully, "there are also those who believe that all whites must be driven from these lands, who see any attempt at peace as weakness or betrayal. I have heard the same word traitor spoken in our council lodge about those who would negotiate rather than fight." His voice carried the weight of personal experience, suggesting that he too had faced criticism for his willingness to consider alternatives to endless warfare. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching storm clouds and the distant howl of wolves beginning their evening hunt. Abby shivered, suddenly aware that her torn dress provided little protection against the elements, and that night would bring dangers far beyond human cruelty. Mapia noticed her discomfort immediately, his training as a warrior extending naturally to the protection of those under his care. Without speaking, he removed his buckskin jacket and draped it carefully around her shoulders, taking care not to disturb the fresh brand. "I cannot return to the settlement," Abby said, the reality of her situation becoming clearer with each passing moment. "Even if they didn't kill me outright, they would find other ways to make me pay for what they see as my crimes against their vision of progress." She looked out across the endless grassland, seeing not freedom but a hostile wilderness that could swallow a lone woman without trace. "And I cannot ask you to risk more than you already have by helping me." "You did not ask," Mapia replied simply, "and warriors of the Kit Fox Society do not abandon those they have chosen to protect." He paused, considering his next words. "With the gravity they deserved. There is a place 3 days' ride from here, where the old trading trails cross near Badger Creek. My grandmother keeps a lodge there, away from both white settlements and tribal camps. She has healing knowledge that could tend your wounds properly, and she asks no questions of those who seek shelter." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, representing not just physical sanctuary, but a fundamental choice about the kind of future each was willing to embrace. For Abby, accepting meant abandoning forever the world she had known, the comfortable certainties of civilization for the unknown challenges of a life lived between cultures. For Mapia, it meant continuing down a path that had already marked him as different among his own people, further cementing his reputation as one who valued individual conscience over tribal loyalty. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall, each droplet carrying the promise of a storm that would wash away their tracks, but also expose them to the merciless elements of the prairie night. Mapia rose to his feet with fluid grace, extending his hand to help Abby stand. The gesture was simple, practical, but it carried within it all the complexity of the choice before them: to trust across the divide of race and culture, to believe that common humanity could triumph over the hatred that seemed to define their respective worlds. Abby hesitated for a moment, staring at his outstretched hand as if it represented far more than simple assistance. In many ways, it did. Taking that hand would mean accepting not just his help, but entering a world she had only glimpsed during the secret peace meetings. It would mean trusting her life to someone her own people had taught her to fear, someone whose very existence represented everything the settlers believed they were fighting against. Yet as another rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, and the rain began to fall harder, she realized that her alternatives had been stripped away as surely as her honor had been burned from her flesh. She grasped his hand, feeling the calloused strength of fingers that had known both the grip of weapons and the gentle touch of healing herbs. Mapia pulled her to her feet with careful strength, his movements economical and purposeful. The buckskin jacket he had given her provided some protection against the increasing rain, but both of them knew that their current shelter was inadequate for the storm that was building. Dark clouds were massing on the horizon like an army of shadows, and the wind carried the electric scent of lightning yet to come. "My horse is hidden in the cottonwood grove beyond that ridge," Mapia said, pointing toward a line of trees, barely visible through the gathering gloom. "We must reach shelter before the storm breaks fully, or the rain will make travel impossible until morning." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "Are you strong enough to ride?" "The brand wound will make it painful, but remaining here could be more dangerous than moving." Abby nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain of her own strength. The trauma of the day had left her feeling hollowed out, as if someone had scooped away everything solid and reliable about her existence, leaving only a fragile shell behind. But she had survived the branding, survived the terror of lying helpless before an approaching train, and she would find a way to survive whatever came next. "I can ride," she said, her voice carrying more conviction than she felt. "I've been riding since I was old enough to reach the stirrups." They began making their way across the uneven grassland, Mapia setting a pace that was swift but mindful of her injuries. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass that seemed to swallow distance and make every destination feel impossibly remote. Abby had always found the vastness of this land both beautiful and terrifying, beautiful in its raw, untamed majesty, terrifying in its indifference to human struggles and ambitions. Tonight, as storm clouds gathered overhead and she walked beside a Sioux warrior toward an uncertain future, both qualities seemed magnified beyond anything she had previously experienced. As they walked, Mapia kept his senses alert for any signs of danger. His eyes scanned the horizon for riders, his ears strained for sounds that didn't belong to the natural symphony of wind and grass and distant thunder. The men who had left Abby to die might return to ensure their work was completed, or other hostile forces might be moving through this territory under cover of the approaching storm. But more than external threats, he was conscious of the woman beside him, the way she favored her left side where the brand burned, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of shock not yet fully processed. The cottonwood grove appeared gradually through the increasing rain, its trees standing like ancient sentinels against the darkening sky. These trees had witnessed decades of conflict and change, had provided shelter for countless travelers crossing the disputed territories between white settlements and tribal lands. Their thick trunks bore the scars of lightning strikes and knife marks where messages had been carved by those who passed this way, a natural bulletin board for a land where formal communication was often impossible. Mapia's horse stood patiently beneath the largest tree, a magnificent paint stallion whose black and white markings seemed to mirror the stormy sky above. The animal was clearly well trained, standing without hobbles or tethers, trusting in its master's call to keep it from wandering. As they approached, the horse lifted its head and nickered softly, recognizing Mapia's distinctive whistle. The sound was comforting in its normalcy, a reminder that some bonds transcended the chaos of human conflict. "His name is Yella," Mapia said as he checked the horse's tack and supplies. "It means little thunder in my language. My father gave him to me when I completed my vision quest 5 winters ago." There was pride in his voice, the kind of deep affection that spoke of a partnership forged through shared dangers and mutual trust. "He has carried me safely through more battles than I care to count, and his speed has saved my life more than once." Abby approached the horse cautiously, extending her hand for him to sniff. Yella regarded her with intelligent dark eyes, seeming to sense her injured state and responding with unusual gentleness. When she touched his neck, the stallion stood perfectly still, as if understanding that sudden movements might cause her pain. The moment of connection between woman and horse provided a brief respite from the larger fears and uncertainties that surrounded them. "He likes you," Mapia observed, a note of surprise in his voice. Wakanyela is usually suspicious of strangers, especially those who carry the scent of fear or pain. But he recognizes something in you, perhaps the same quality that made you brave enough to attend the peace meetings when others counseled only war. He began securing his rifle and other supplies more tightly to the saddle, preparing for a ride through increasingly dangerous weather. The rain was falling steadily now, transforming the dust of the prairie into slick mud that would make footing treacherous for both horse and riders. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. They needed to reach proper shelter soon, but Abby realized she had no clear idea of where that shelter might be found in this vast and seemingly empty landscape. "Your grandmother's lodge," she said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the wind. "How far is it really? And what will she think of you bringing a white woman to her door?" The questions revealed her growing anxiety about the practical realities of their situation, the understanding that rescue was only the first step in a journey that might prove even more challenging than the immediate crisis they had survived. Mapia finished his preparations and turned to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. 3 days hard riding in good weather, perhaps 4 in this storm. And my grandmother, Winona, has seen 92 winters come and go. She has witnessed more changes in this land than any person should have to bear, but she has also learned that wisdom lies in judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. He paused, considering his next words carefully. "She will ask you one question, and your answer will determine whether you are welcome in her lodge." "What question?" Abby asked, though part of her feared the answer. "She will ask if you come seeking to take something from our people, or if you come seeking to give something back to the world." Mapia's eyes met hers steadily. "Think carefully about your answer, because she will know if you speak anything other than the complete truth." The storm unleashed its full fury just as Mapia lifted Abby onto Wakanyela's back, her gasp of pain from the branded shoulder lost in the sudden roar of wind and rain that swept across the prairie like the breath of angry spirits. Lightning split the sky with blinding intensity, illuminating the grassland in stark black and white before plunging everything back into premature darkness. The thunder that followed seemed to crack the very foundations of the earth, causing Wakanyela to dance nervously beneath his riders despite his usual steady temperament. Mapia swung up behind Abby with practiced ease, his arms encircling her protectively as he gathered the reins. The intimate contact was necessary for her safety, but both were acutely aware of how such proximity would be viewed by their respective peoples as either profound betrayal or dangerous precedent. The warmth of his body against her back provided some comfort against the driving rain, though nothing could ease the fire that continued to burn in her branded flesh with each movement of the horse. "Hold tight," Mapia called over the wind, his lips close to her ear to ensure she could hear him above the storm's fury. "Wakanyela knows these trails even in darkness, but the rain will make the footing treacherous. If you feel yourself slipping, tell me immediately." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command in dangerous situations, but there was also a gentleness there that spoke of genuine concern for her welfare. They rode into the teeth of the storm, heading northwest toward distant hills that were barely visible through the sheets of rain. The prairie had transformed into something alien and hostile, the familiar grassland becoming a maze of hidden gullies and slippery slopes that could trap or injure an unwary horse. Lightning continued to flash overhead with increasing frequency, turning the world into a series of frozen tableau grass bent nearly horizontal by wind, scattered buffalo bones gleaming white in the electric glare, the distant silhouette of a lone coyote seeking its own shelter from the tempest. Abby found herself pressed back against Mapia's chest as Wakanyela fought through the storm, the horse's powerful muscles bunching and releasing with each careful step. The pain from her shoulder had settled into a constant throbbing ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, but she forced herself to remain alert to their surroundings. The landscape they traversed was unlike anything she had experienced. During her sheltered life in the railroad settlement, where the worst weather had been endured from behind sturdy walls and beneath solid roofs, as they crested a low ridge, a new sound joined the symphony of wind and thunder, the distant howling of wolves beginning their nightly hunt. The primitive sound sent chills down Abby's spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through her clothes. She had heard wolves before, but always from the safety of the settlement where armed men and blazing fires kept the predators at a respectful distance. Out here in the open prairie, with the scent of her blood possibly carrying on the wind, they represented a threat that was both immediate and terrifying. "The wolves smell your wound," Mapia said, his voice calm, despite the ominous implications of his words. "But they will not approach while we are mounted and moving. Wekinyila's size and our combined scent will make them cautious. Still, we cannot afford to stop until we reach better shelter." He urged the horse forward with subtle pressure from his knees, guiding them along a barely visible game trail that seemed to materialize from the darkness only when lightning provided brief illumination. The hours passed in a blur of discomfort and mounting exhaustion as they fought their way through the storm's relentless assault. Abby's initial determination began to waver as the combined effects of shock, pain, and exposure took their toll on her already weakened condition. She found herself swaying in the saddle despite Mapia's supporting arms, her vision blurring as waves of dizziness washed over her. The brand on her shoulder felt like a live coal pressed against her flesh, the pain intensifying with each jolt and sway of their progress. Sensing her distress, Mapia began to speak in low, steady tones, his voice providing an anchor of human contact in the midst of the storm's chaos. He told her about the landmarks they were passing. Invisible though they might be in the darkness, the ancient buffalo wallows where great herds had once gathered, the sacred springs where his people had held ceremonies for countless generations, the hidden valleys where wild horses still ran free from the encroachment of civilization. His words painted pictures of a land rich with history and meaning, a perspective that was entirely foreign to her settler upbringing. "My grandfather used to say that storms like this one carry messages from the spirits," Mapia continued, his breath warm against her ear as lightning illuminated a grove of twisted oak trees ahead. "They wash away the old grudges and prepare the earth for new growth. Perhaps tonight's storm is washing away the hatred between our peoples, making space for something better to take root." There was hope in his voice, tempered by the realism of someone who had seen too much conflict to believe in easy solutions. As they approached the oak grove, Wekinyiela suddenly shied to the left, his ears pricked forward in alarm. Mapia immediately tightened his grip on the reins while reaching for the knife at his belt, his warrior instincts recognizing the horse's warning even before his human senses could identify the source of danger. Through the rain and darkness came the sound of horses moving fast, the splash of hooves through mud and the jingle of metal gear that suggested a mounted party traveling with purpose rather than leisure. "Riders," Mapia whispered urgently, guiding Wekinyiela into the deeper shadows beneath the oak trees. "Too many horses to be a hunting party, and moving too fast for traders. Could be cavalry patrol, or settlers searching for you." He paused, listening intently to the approaching sounds. "Either way, they mean danger for both of us. We must let them pass without being discovered." They sat frozen in the darkness as the riders drew closer, their voices occasionally audible over the storm's noise. Abby recognized the harsh tones of Jeremiah Wade, the settlement's self-appointed leader and the man who had ordered her branding and execution. His words carried clearly on the wind as he shouted orders to his companions, each syllable dripping with the kind of righteous fury that had driven him to mark her as a traitor. "Spread out and search every grove, every depression that might provide shelter," Wade commanded, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. That train engineer swore he saw two figures near the tracks before the storm hit. If that engine-loving traitor somehow survived, I want her found and finished properly this time. And if any redskin helped her, I want his scalp hanging from my saddle by morning. The casual brutality of his words sent ice through Abby's veins that had nothing to do with the storm's chill. She pressed closer to Mapia, feeling his muscles tense with controlled anger as he listened to the threats against both their lives. His hand moved instinctively to his tomahawk, the warrior's impulse to meet aggression with violence, warring against the practical need to remain hidden. 7 riders against one, even one as skilled as he, would mean certain death for both of them. One of Wade's men rode closer to their hiding place, his horse's hooves squelching in the mud just yards from where they sat concealed. The searcher carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows through the rain, its feeble light probing the darkness like a malevolent eye. Abby held her breath as the beam swept past their position, certain that discovery was inevitable, that their brief respite from danger was about to end in capture and death. But Wakanyela remained perfectly still, trained by years of warfare. To stand silent even in the face of mortal peril. The searcher's horse snorted and stamped, made nervous by the storm and perhaps sensing the presence of the hidden stallion. But its rider attributed the animal's restlessness to the weather and moved on without investigating further. The lantern light faded back into the storm, leaving them in darkness that felt like a reprieve from the executioner's blade. "She ain't here, Wade," the searcher called back to his leader, his voice already being swallowed by distance and rain, nothing but trees and mud. If she was ever in this area, the storms washed away any trace of her passing. There was relief in his tone, suggesting that not all of Wade's followers shared his enthusiasm for hunting down a wounded woman in the middle of a fierce storm. "Keep looking," Wade snarled in response, though his own voice carried a note of frustration that suggested he was beginning to question the wisdom of pursuing his vendetta in such conditions. "I want every hiding place checked between here and the railroad. That girl knows too much about our plans, and I won't have her running to the cavalry with tales of what we're building out here." The mention of mysterious plans sent a chill of new fear through Abby as she realized that her punishment had been about more than simple revenge for her peacemaking efforts. Wade and his followers were clearly involved in activities that went beyond the normal business of frontier settlement, activities that required secrecy and would be threatened by outside scrutiny. Her branding and attempted execution had been as much about silencing a potential witness as punishing a perceived traitor. Gradually, the sounds of the search party faded into the storm as Wade's men continued their systematic sweep of the area. Mapia waited long minutes after the last horse had passed before relaxing his vigilant posture, ensuring that no stragglers remained behind to discover their hiding place. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a grim understanding of how much their situation had deteriorated. "They will not give up easily," he said, urging Wakanyela forward once again as they left the temporary safety of the oak grove. Wade's voice carries the sound of a man who fears exposure more than he desires revenge. Whatever plans he mentioned, they must be significant enough to justify risking his men's lives in this storm. Lightning flashed again, revealing the troubled expression on his face as he contemplated the implications. The remainder of their night journey passed in tense silence, as they navigated the treacherous terrain while remaining alert for any signs of pursuit. The storm gradually began to exhaust itself as dawn approached, the violent downpour settling into a steady drizzle that continued to make travel difficult, but no longer posed the immediate threat of the earlier tempest. With the growing light came new visibility, but also increased danger of being spotted by their enemies. As the sun struggled to penetrate the thick cloud cover, they found themselves approaching a landscape that was markedly different from the open prairie they had been crossing. Rolling hills covered with scattered pine and juniper trees provided more cover but also more places for ambushes, while rocky outcroppings and narrow valleys created a maze of potential routes that could either provide escape or become deadly. "Traps, we are entering the borderlands," Mapia explained as they paused on a ridge to survey the terrain ahead. "Neither white settlers nor my people claim this territory permanently, though both pass through it. The hunting is good here, but so is the danger. Outlaws and renegades from both sides use these hills as hiding places, and they show mercy to no one who threatens their safety." Abby studied the forbidding landscape ahead, noting how different it appeared from both the manicured farmland around the railroad settlement and the endless grassland of the open prairie. This was truly wild country, untamed by civilization and untouched by the grand plans of progress that drove men like her father to survey railroad routes through indigenous lands. Here, survival depended entirely on individual skill and courage, rather than the protection of community and law. "How much further to your grandmother's lodge?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of breathing the storm's moisture. The pain in her shoulder had settled into a constant, grinding ache that sapped her strength with each passing hour, and she could fever beginning to build in her body as infection took hold in the branded flesh. Without proper medical attention, soon she knew that surviving Wade's pursuit might prove meaningless. "Half a day's ride through the canyon country," Mapia replied, pointing toward a gap between two prominent peaks that seemed to beckon them forward into the unknown. "But it is the most dangerous part of our journey. The trail is narrow, with many places where enemies could trap us, and Wakanyela will be carrying double weight on treacherous footing." He paused, studying her pale face with growing concern. "Are you strong enough to continue, or should we find shelter here while you rest?" Diego Ramirez stood slowly, his scarred face impassive as he considered this development. "Rodriguez, take 3 men and see what they want. If they're looking for someone or something, find out what. If they're law enforcement, convince them to look elsewhere. If they won't be convinced, make sure they don't leave to report what they've seen here." The cold pragmatism in his voice left no doubt about his willingness to add murder to the day's activities if circumstances required. Mapia felt Abby stiffen against his chest as she too grasped the lethal implications of their situation. Wade's vengeful pursuit had led them into a trap that could destroy not only their own lives, but potentially dozens of others if the weapons theft proceeded as planned. As Rodriguez and his companions rode toward the canyon entrance to intercept Wade's party, Mapia made a decision that embodied both desperate courage and strategic thinking. Sliding down from Wakanyela's back, he helped Abby dismount and guided her into a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. The space was cramped and dark, but it offered concealment and protection from stray bullets if violence erupted. "Stay here and try to remain conscious," he whispered urgently, pressing his spare knife into her trembling hands. "I'm going to create a distraction that might allow us to escape, but it will require me to take risks that could get us both killed if you can't hold on a little longer." His dark eyes searched her feverish face, looking for some sign that she understood the gravity of what he was planning. Abby gripped the knife handle with shaking fingers, her fevered mind struggling to focus on his words through the haze of pain and delirium. "What are you going to do?" she managed to ask, though part of her feared the answer. She had seen enough violence in recent days to understand that whatever plan he was forming would likely involve the kind of calculated brutality that survival in this lawless land sometimes demanded. "I'm going to steal their horses and scatter their weapons," Mapia replied with grim determination. "Without mounts, they can't pursue the weapons shipment or chase us if we manage to escape. It will also create enough chaos to mask our movements and possibly allow Wade's men and the outlaws to eliminate each other." The plan was audacious to the point of madness, requiring split-second timing and the kind of luck that rarely favored the desperate. Before Abby could voice her objections or fears, the sound of gunfire erupted from the canyon entrance as Wade's confrontation with Rodriguez's group turned violent. The sharp crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, creating a chaotic symphony of warfare that sent birds exploding from their roosts and caused the outlaws' horses to rear and snort in alarm. Mappi'a used the distraction to begin his approach to the enemy camp, moving with the fluid stealth that had made him legendary among his own people. The battle at the canyon mouth was brief but savage, with Rodriguez's men having the advantages of position and preparation while Wade's party possessed the desperation of hunters who had tracked their prey too far to turn back without satisfaction. Through the smoke and confusion, Abby could see muzzle flashes and hear the screams of wounded men and horses, sounds that spoke of the kind of violence that left few survivors and fewer heroes. Mappi'a reached the picket line where the outlaws' horses were tethered, using his knife to cut the restraining ropes with swift efficiency while the animal's attention was focused on the gunfire. His movements were economical and precise, each cut freeing another valuable mount and adding to the chaos that would soon engulf the camp. The horses, already nervous from the shooting, needed little encouragement to bolt once their restraints were severed. As the freed animals began to scatter, Mappi'a turned his attention to the stacked weapons, using his tomahawk to damage firing pins and scatter ammunition across the ground where it would be difficult to recover quickly. The work was dangerous, exposing him to discovery with each passing second, but the potential consequences of allowing these weapons to reach their intended recipients justified almost any risk. Diego Ramirez was the first to notice the chaos spreading through his camp as horses galloped in all directions, and his carefully organized arsenal fell into disarray. His roar of rage cut through the sound of distant gunfire as he realized that an enemy had penetrated his defenses and was systematically destroying his resources. "Find whoever is doing this and kill them," he bellowed, drawing his pistol and scanning the area for targets. The remaining outlaws responded with the quick efficiency of experienced fighters, spreading out to search for the saboteur while trying to salvage what they could of their scattered equipment. But Mappi'a had already melted back into the shadows, his warrior training allowing him to move unseen, even as armed men searched desperately for any sign of his presence. The confusion he had created was growing exponentially as frightened horses crashed through the camp and panicked men fired at shadows from her hiding place. Abby watched the unfolding chaos with a mixture of admiration and terror, recognizing that Mappia''s plan was working even as it placed him in mortal danger. The fever that clouded her thinking made the scene seem surreal, like a vivid nightmare where violence and heroism blended into something beyond ordinary human experience. She gripped the knife he had given her and tried to prepare herself for whatever role she might need to play in their escape. The explosion that shattered the morning calm came without warning, a thunderous roar that sent shockwaves through the canyon walls and brought down a cascade of loose rock from the heights above. Mappi'a had discovered the outlaws' hidden cache of dynamite intended for mining operations, and in a moment of desperate inspiration, he had used it to seal the main canyon entrance behind Wade's retreating survivors. The blast not only trapped the remaining Comancheros in the valley but also created a diversion that allowed him to reach Abby's hiding place as chaos consumed the outlaw camp. Through the smoke and dust, Diego Ramirez emerged like a demon from hell itself, his scarred face streaked with blood from a head wound and his eyes burning with the kind of fury that only comes from seeing years of careful planning destroyed in a matter of minutes. 3 of his men lay dead from the gunfight with Wade's party, while the rest scrambled to salvage what remained of their scattered weapons and round up the few horses that hadn't bolted during Mappia''s sabotage. The outlaw leader's voice cut through the confusion like a blade, organizing his surviving followers for a hunt that would end only in death. "Burn every hiding place in this valley," Ramirez commanded, his accent thick with rage as he gestured toward the ancient ruins and rock formations that dotted the landscape. "Whoever did this is still here, and I want them found before nightfall. Check every cave, every crevice, every shadow that could shelter a rat. And when you find them, Bring them to me alive so I can teach them what happens to those who cross. Diego Ramirez, Abby's condition, had deteriorated rapidly during the violence, her fever spiking to dangerous levels as the infection spread through her system like liquid fire. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind trapped in a maze of fevered nightmares where the sound of gunfire, mixed with the rhythmic hammering of railroad construction and the screaming of branded cattle. When Mapia reached her side, he found her muttering incoherently about trains that ran on tracks made of human bones and settlements built on foundations of betrayal. "We have to move now," he whispered urgently, gathering her weakened form into his arms despite the risk of exposing them both to the searchers who were already beginning to probe the areas around their hiding place. "My grandmother's lodge is only 2 hours away, but the path requires us to cross open ground where will be visible to anyone watching from the canyon rim." The weight of their impossible situation pressed down on him like a physical burden, forcing him to make decisions that balanced hope against desperation. The route to Winona's lodge led through a series of interconnected ravines that would provide some concealment, but also required them to abandon Wakanyela, whose distinctive markings and size would make him too conspicuous for stealthy travel. Mapia made the painful decision to release his beloved horse, slapping the stallion's flank and sending him galloping toward the high country where his wild instincts would keep him safe from capture. The sight of his faithful companion disappearing into the wilderness felt like severing a vital connection to his past and identity. Carrying Abby proved more challenging than Mapia had anticipated, her dead weight making every step a struggle as he navigated the treacherous terrain while constantly listening for sounds of pursuit. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, punctuated by brief moments of consciousness, when she would grip his arm with surprising strength and whisper fragments of information about Wade's larger plans. Through her fevered ramblings, he began to piece together a picture of conspiracy that extended far beyond simple frontier violence. "Railroad contracts," she mumbled against his shoulder as they paused in the shadow of a towering spire of red rock, her words barely coherent, but carrying an urgency that penetrated even her delirium. "Wade has secret agreements with Eastern investors, plans to acquire tribal lands through violence and frame the tribes for attacks they didn't commit. The weapons theft was meant to arm false flag operations that would justify military intervention." The implications of her revelation struck Mapia like a physical blow, explaining not only Wade's determination to silence her permanently, but also the broader pattern of escalating violence that had been consuming the territory. If her allegations were true, then the recent attacks on both settlements and tribal camps had been orchestrated by men who profited from chaos and used the resulting military responses to seize valuable land for railroad development. The scope of such corruption suggested involvement by powerful interests that extended far beyond the frontier. As they climbed higher into the maze of canyons that surrounded Winona's hidden sanctuary, signs of the old woman's presence began to appear along the trail. Small bundles of sage and sweetgrass hung from tree branches at strategic points, their placement serving both as offerings to protective spirits and as markers for those who knew how to read them. Carved symbols on certain rocks indicated safe water sources and warned of dangerous passages, a communication system that had served travelers in this region for countless generations. The sound of horses echoing from the canyon below indicated that Ramirez's men had found their initial trail and were following it with grim determination. The outlaws possessed tracking skills that rivaled those of professional scouts, and they knew this territory well enough to anticipate the most likely escape routes. Mapia pushed himself harder, his warrior's conditioning allowing him to maintain a punishing pace despite the burden of carrying an unconscious woman through increasingly difficult terrain. Winona's lodge appeared suddenly as they crested a narrow ridge, nestled in a hidden cirque that was invisible from any direction except the treacherous path they had just climbed. The structure was ancient by frontier standards, built from carefully fitted stones and roofed with logs that had been weathered to silver by decades of mountain storms. Smoke rose from the central chimney in a thin column that dissipated quickly in the high-altitude air, suggesting that the old woman was home and prepared for visitors. The grandmother emerged before they had taken a dozen steps toward her door, her aged but still sharp eyes taking in their condition, with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to treating the wounded and desperate. Winona stood barely 5 feet tall, her gray hair braided with strips of beaded leather, and her deeply lined face marked by the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving nearly a century of conflict and change. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of age and the gentle power of someone who had spent decades healing both bodies and spirits. "Grandson of my heart," she said in perfect English, though her words carried the cadence and phrasing of someone whose first language was Lakota. "You bring me a daughter who burns with poison fire and enemies who follow like wolves scenting blood. Come quickly, for the spirits have told me of your coming and prepared the medicines that may yet save her life." She gestured toward the lodge's entrance with hands that were gnarled but steady, moving with the confidence of someone who had treated thousands of injuries over her long lifetime. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the smoke of burning herbs and the rich scents of traditional medicines that had been refined through generations of trial and observation. Bundles of plants hung from the rafters in carefully organized clusters, while clay pots and baskets containing various remedies lined shelves carved into the stone walls. A bed of soft furs had been prepared near the central fire, suggesting that Winona had indeed been expecting their arrival through whatever means of foresight she possessed. Mapia lowered Abby onto the prepared bed with infinite care, noting how her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that spoke of systemic infection, advancing toward the point of no return. The brand wound on her shoulder had become a festering mass of corrupted flesh surrounded by angry red streaks that tracked the poison's progress through her lymphatic system. Without immediate intervention by someone with genuine healing knowledge, she would be dead within hours. Winona examined the wound with practiced efficiency, her experienced fingers probing the damaged tissue while her keen eyes assessed the extent of the infection spread. The old woman's expression grew increasingly grave as she cataloged the various complications presented by the deliberate cruelty of the branding, understanding immediately that this was not a simple burn, but a calculated act of torture designed to maximize both physical damage and psychological trauma. This was done by men who wanted her to suffer as much as die. Winona observed, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that spoke of deep moral outrage. The iron was heated beyond what burning flesh required, and they pressed it deep enough to reach muscle and bone. Such cruelty creates wounds that resist healing and opens doorways for the evil spirits of corruption to enter the body. She began selecting specific herbs from her collection, her movements becoming more urgent as Abby's breathing grew shallower. The sound of voices echoing from the canyon below indicated that their pursuers had discovered the trail leading to the hidden cirque, though the difficult climb would delay them for at least another hour. Mapia positioned himself near the lodge's single window, checking his remaining weapons while keeping watch for any signs of the approaching outlaws. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and he possessed only his knife and tomahawk for close combat, inadequate resources for defending against multiple well-armed attackers. Winona worked with the focused intensity of someone racing against time itself, preparing a complex mixture of roots, bark, and leaves that would either purge the infection from Abby's system or kill her outright if administered incorrectly. The traditional medicine she practiced represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations of healers who had learned to work with the natural world rather than attempting to dominate it through force. "Hold her shoulders while I clean the wound," the old woman instructed, producing a knife that had been heated in the fire until its blade glowed red-hot. The corrupted flesh must be cut away before the healing can begin, and she will likely struggle, even in her unconscious state. Your strength must anchor her to this world, while the medicine spirits decide whether to accept or reject her plea for life. The procedure that followed was a testament to both Winona's skill and Abby's underlying resilience as the old healer. Systematically removed the infected tissue while chanting prayers in the ancient language of her people. The smell of burning flesh filled the lodge once again, but this time it carried the promise of healing rather than the threat of torture. Abby's body convulsed with each application of the heated blade, her unconscious mind recognizing the trauma, even when her conscious awareness remained absent. As Winona worked, she began to speak of visions that had come to her in recent dreams, prophecies concerning a great change that would sweep across the land like a cleansing fire. According to her spiritual understanding, the meeting between Mapia and Abby represented more than simple chance, but rather the working of forces that sought to heal the divisions between peoples through individual acts of courage and compassion. Their survival might serve as a catalyst for broader reconciliation if they could overcome the immediate threats to their lives. The spirits have shown me a time when the iron roads will carry messages of peace rather than instruments of war. She continued while applying a poultice made from plants that most white doctors would have dismissed as primitive superstition. But such a future requires bridges built from trust rather than barriers built from fear, and you two may be the first stones in such a foundation. Her words carried the weight of genuine prophecy, offering hope even in their desperate circumstances. The voices from outside grew louder as Ramirez's men finally reached the approach to the hidden cirque, their harsh shouts indicating that they had discovered the lodge and were preparing for an assault. Mapia counted at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more, representing odds that would challenge even a fully armed warrior in good defensive position. The lodge's stone construction would provide some protection against rifle fire, but it would also become a trap if the attackers managed to surround it completely. There is another way out, Winona said quietly, noting his assessment of their tactical situation while continuing her medical work without pause. Behind the medicine shelf lies a passage that connects to caves extending deep into the mountain. My ancestors used these tunnels during the time of the first horse soldiers, and they remain hidden from those who do not know the proper signs to seek. She gestured toward a section of wall that appeared solid but apparently concealed an escape route. The old woman's revelation offered hope, but also presented new challenges, as moving Abby through unknown underground passages, while she remained unconscious and critically ill, could prove as dangerous as facing the outlaws directly. Mapia weighed their options with the careful calculation of someone whose survival had depended on making correct decisions under extreme pressure, understanding that either choice carried the potential for disaster as the first gunshots began to ring out against the lodge's stone walls. Winona completed her initial treatment of Abby's wound and began administering the powerful herbal mixture that would either begin the process of healing or provide a peaceful death. The old woman's hands moved with practiced confidence even as bullets whined overhead. Her concentration focused entirely on the delicate balance between medicine and poison that could save or destroy the young woman who had become the center of so much conflict. Whatever happens next, Winona said as she prepared additional supplies for their potential flight into the mountain's depths. Remember that healing requires both courage and patience, and that the bonds formed and shared suffering often prove stronger than those created in times of peace. You have already saved each other's lives. Now you must learn to save each other's souls. The underground labyrinth stretched through the mountain's heart like arteries of darkness, carved by centuries of flowing water and enlarged by generations of people who had sought refuge from the storms of history above. Mapia carried the still unconscious Abby through passages that his grandmother had navigated by touch and memory, following a route that would emerge miles away from the besieged lodge where Winona now faced Diego Ramirez's fury alone. The old woman had insisted on remaining behind to complete a sacred ritual that would either save Abby's life or ensure her peaceful passage to the spirit world. Behind them, The sound of gunfire had given way to an ominous silence that suggested the outlaws had either breached the lodge's defenses or discovered that their quarry had vanished into the mountain itself. Winona possessed knowledge that made her valuable even to men like Ramirez, her reputation as a healer extending throughout the borderlands where violence and injury were constant companions. Whether that reputation would protect her or merely delay her execution remained a question that haunted Mapia as he navigated the treacherous underground terrain. The herbal mixture that Winona had administered was beginning to take effect, drawing the infection from Abby's branded shoulder like a magnet pulls iron filings from sand. Her fever broke in violent waves of perspiration that soaked through her torn dress and left her shivering. Despite the constant temperature of the caves, consciousness returned gradually, bringing with it memories of pain and terror that caused her to cry out in languages that mixed English with half-remembered fragments of Lakota learned during the peace negotiations. "Where are we?" she whispered. When awareness finally solidified enough for coherent speech, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space, as Mapia paused to let her drink from an underground stream that tasted of minerals and ancient stone. I remember the old woman, her hands like fire on my shoulder, then darkness that felt like falling through the earth itself. The caves around them seemed to pulse with mysterious life, their walls adorned with formations that resembled frozen waterfalls and crystalline gardens. Mapia explained their situation while helping her to walk, her legs still unsteady but growing stronger with each step as Winona's medicine continued its work. The passages they followed showed signs of long habitation, with carved niches that had once held torches and smooth floors, worn by countless feet over generations of use. Ancient pictographs adorned certain walls, depicting scenes of refuge and renewal that seemed to echo their own desperate flight from persecution. Hours passed in steady progress through the mountain's depths, guided by landmarks that Winona had described in careful detail before sending them into the darkness. The route was complex, requiring them to choose correctly at numerous intersections, where wrong turns could lead to dead ends or dangerous drop-offs. But gradually, they began to notice changes in the air currents and the quality of sound that suggested they were approaching the surface world once again. The cave mouth that finally appeared ahead of them opened onto a vista that neither had expected to see, a broad valley where the morning sun illuminated fields of wild grass dotted with the remnants of an ancient settlement. Stone foundations marked where a peaceful community had once thrived, their geometric patterns suggesting a level of organization and permanence that contradicted everything both cultures had been taught about the peoples who had inhabited this land before them. A clear stream wound through the ruins, its banks lined with fruit trees that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. "This place has been forgotten by both our peoples," Mapia observed as they emerged into daylight that felt like a blessing after hours in the mountain's depths. "According to my grandmother's stories, the people who built this settlement lived in harmony with the land for over 100 years before drought and disease forced them to move on. They left behind knowledge written in stone for those who would come after them. Among the ruins, they discovered carvings that depicted agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, and what appeared to be a sophisticated system of water management that had allowed crops to flourish even during dry seasons. The evidence suggested a culture that had achieved remarkable sustainability through cooperation rather than conquest, offering a model for coexistence that seemed almost impossible in their current world of perpetual conflict. As Abby's strength continued to return, she began to examine the stone carvings with the educated eye of someone whose father had taught her to read the landscape for railroad surveying purposes. What she discovered challenged everything she had been taught about the history and capabilities of indigenous peoples, the mathematical precision of the astronomical alignments, the engineering sophistication of the irrigation channels, and the artistic beauty of the decorative elements all pointed to a civilization that had been far more advanced than frontier. Mythology acknowledged, "My father needs to see this." she said with growing excitement as the implications of their discovery became clear. If evidence like this were properly documented and presented to the territorial government, it could change how people think about land rights and the potential for peaceful coexistence. Her voice carried a hope that seemed almost miraculous after everything they had endured, suggesting that their suffering might yet serve a purpose greater than mere survival. Their exploration of the ruins was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, a cavalry patrol led by Captain James Morrison, Abby's uncle and a career officer whose reputation for fairness had earned him respect among both settlers and tribal leaders. Morrison had been tracking the movements of various outlaw groups in the region when the explosion at the canyon had drawn his attention to the area. His weathered face showed both relief and concern as he recognized his niece among the ruins. "Abigail. Thank God you're alive," Morrison said as he dismounted and approached them with careful awareness that Mapia might view the soldiers as a threat. "We found evidence of the attack on Wade's party and followed the trail to an old woman's lodge where we discovered signs of a pitched battle. The local Comancheros claimed they had killed both of you, but something about their story didn't ring true." His eyes took in her branded shoulder and disheveled condition with the sharp assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating casualties. The captain's arrival presented both opportunity and danger, as his military authority could provide protection from further outlaw attacks but might also lead to Mapia's arrest or worse if the wrong conclusions were drawn about their relationship. Abby quickly explained the true circumstances of her rescue and the larger conspiracy involving Wade's illegal land acquisition schemes, providing details that corroborated intelligence Morrison had been gathering about suspicious activities in the territory. "Diego Ramirez and his men are already in custody," Morrison informed them, his tone carrying the satisfaction of a professional soldier who had successfully completed a difficult mission. "We arrived at the lodge in time to prevent them from harming the old woman, though she proved quite capable of defending herself with methods I'd rather not describe in detail. She claimed you had been taken by the mountain spirits to a place where healing could occur without interference from foolish men." The news that Winona had survived the outlaw attack lifted a tremendous weight from Mapia's heart, confirming that the old woman's wisdom extended to practical matters of survival as well as spiritual healing. Her decision to remain behind had not been a futile sacrifice, but a calculated strategy that had ultimately led to the capture of dangerous criminals who had terrorized the borderlands for years. Morrison's investigation had uncovered evidence of the broader conspiracy that Abby had described in her fevered ramblings, including documents that implicated Wade and several Eastern investors in a scheme to provoke Indian wars that would justify military intervention and subsequent land seizures. The captain's honest reputation and careful documentation would ensure that the evidence received proper attention from territorial authorities who had the power to bring the conspirators to justice. "The railroad will still come," Morrison acknowledged as they prepared to leave the ancient settlement, "but it will come through legal means that respect existing treaties and provide fair compensation for any land that must be acquired. Men like Wade have damaged the cause of legitimate progress with their greed and brutality, but that doesn't mean all development must cease." His words offered a vision of a future where advancement and preservation might coexist rather than remain forever at war. As they rode toward the territorial capital where Abby would testify about the conspiracy and Mapia would be granted safe passage back to his people, both reflected on how much their lives had changed since that desperate morning when death had seemed certain. The scars they bore would serve as permanent reminders of their ordeal, but also as symbols of their courage in choosing compassion over hatred when such choices seemed impossible. The ancient settlement behind them represented something more than archaeological curiosity. It stood as proof that different peoples could build something beautiful together when they chose cooperation over conquest. The water management system still functioned perfectly after decades of abandonment, The fruit trees continued to bear nourishment for any traveler who might need it, and the stone carvings preserved knowledge that could benefit future generations. Regardless of their cultural origins, 6 months later, Abby found herself standing before a gathering of territorial officials, tribal representatives, and railroad executives in the Capitol building's largest conference room. The brand scar on her shoulder had healed into a pattern of white lines that she wore openly as a badge of honor rather than shame, testament to her survival of an ordeal that had revealed both the worst and best of human nature. Her testimony had already led to the arrest and conviction of Wade and his co-conspirators, but today's meeting concerned something far more significant. The proposal she presented drew directly from the lessons learned at the ancient settlement, outlining a framework for railroad development that would employ workers from all cultural backgrounds, provide training in new technologies while preserving traditional knowledge, and establish profit-sharing arrangements that would benefit entire communities rather than enriching only outside investors. The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming naive, but it was supported by detailed documentation and practical examples that made it difficult to dismiss. Mapia sat in the section reserved for tribal delegates, his presence serving as both witness to her testimony and symbol of the new relationships that were slowly taking shape across the territory. The Kit Fox Society had formally recognized his actions during the crisis as exemplifying the highest ideals of warrior conduct, while his own people had begun to see him as a bridge between worlds rather than an outcast caught between them. The railroad executives initially resisted the proposal's more progressive elements, arguing that such innovations would increase costs and complicate construction schedules. But the territorial governor, influenced by Morrison's detailed reports about the conspiracy and its consequences, made it clear that future development projects would be subject to new oversight requirements, designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had nearly led to open warfare. The choice before us is simple, Abby concluded her presentation with words that echoed through the conference room, like a challenge to every assumption about progress and civilization. We can continue building a future on foundations of fear and exploitation, or we can choose to build something worthy of the generations who will inherit what we create today. The railroad will come regardless of our decision here, but whether it brings prosperity or poverty, peace or war, depends entirely on the courage we show in this moment. The vote that followed was closer than anyone had predicted, but it ultimately approved the framework that would govern railroad construction for the next decade. More importantly, it established precedents for consultation and cooperation that would influence territorial policy on everything, from mining rights to agricultural development. The ancient settlement's example of sustainable coexistence had found new expression in the complex realities of a rapidly changing world years later. When the first trains began running on the completed railroad line, they carried passengers and cargo that reflected the territory's new diversity and prosperity. Former enemies worked side by side in businesses that had grown from the opportunities created by improved transportation, while children who might have been raised to hate each other instead learned multiple languages and traditions in schools that celebrated rather than suppressed cultural differences. Abby and Mapia never married in any ceremony that either culture would have recognized as legal, but they built a life together that honored both their heritages while creating something entirely new. Their home, constructed near the site of the ancient settlement, became a gathering place for travelers, traders, and dreamers who saw possibility where others perceived only problems. The fruit trees they planted grew strong in soil, enriched by the wisdom of those who had come before. The railroad depot that eventually rose nearby bore a plaque, commemorating the courage of all those who had chosen bridge building over barrier construction. During the territory's transformation from battleground to community, the inscription, carved in both English and Lakota, simply read, "Here, enemies became family," and the rails carried hope as well as commerce to distant shores. 25 years had passed since the morning when death rode the rails through Nebraska Territory, and the world had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who lived through those violent days of reckoning. The Great Transcontinental Railroad now carried more than cargo and passengers. It transported ideas, cultures, and dreams across a continent that had learned to see diversity as strength rather than division as destiny. From the window of the westbound passenger car, an elderly woman watched the familiar landscape roll past while her weathered fingers traced the faded scars that still marked her left shoulder. Abigail Morrison Mapia had become something that no one could have. Predicted during those dark days when hatred seemed the only language spoken between peoples. At 64, she served as the Territorial Commissioner for Indigenous Affairs, a position that had been created specifically to address the complex legal and cultural issues arising from the new model of cooperative development that her testimony had helped establish decades earlier. Her hair, now silver white and worn in a style that honored both her settler heritage and adopted Lakota traditions, caught the sunlight streaming through the train car's windows. Beside her sat a young man whose mixed heritage was evident in features that blended European and Native American ancestry in ways that spoke of love rather than conquest. Thomas Mapia Preston, her adopted son and heir to a legacy that transcended racial boundaries, worked as a senior engineer for the railroad company while also serving as a cultural liaison who ensured that construction projects respected sacred sites and traditional hunting grounds. His presence on this particular journey carried special significance that went far beyond professional duties. They were traveling to the dedication ceremony for the new university that would be built on the site where Winona's Healing Lodge had once stood, an institution designed to preserve and teach the traditional knowledge of all the peoples who had shaped the territory's development. The old Lakota healer had lived to see her 98th birthday before passing peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a written collection of medical knowledge that would revolutionize frontier healthcare and earn recognition from physicians. As far away as Boston and San Francisco, the train itself represented the evolution of technology guided by wisdom rather than mere profit. Its design incorporating safety features developed through consultation with tribal engineers who understood how to work with natural forces rather than simply overpowering them. The locomotives burned a special mixture of coal and processed biomass that reduced the black smoke that had once choked the prairies, while the tracks followed routes that avoided disrupting migration patterns and sacred sites identified through collaborative mapping projects. As they approached the station where Captain Morrison waited with a delegation of territorial officials, Abby reflected on the circuitous path that had led from that desperate morning of rescue to this moment of celebration. The scars she bore had become symbols of survival rather than shame, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with proper care and surrounded by genuine love. Her marriage to Mapia had never been legally recognized by either government, but it had produced a family that included children from 3 different tribes and 2 settler communities. The platform bustled with an energy that spoke of genuine prosperity rather than the desperate expansion that had characterized earlier phases of Western development. Native American traders sold traditional crafts alongside European immigrants, offering specialized tools, while children of mixed heritage played games that incorporated elements from multiple cultural traditions. The economic model that had emerged from the collaborative railroad project had created opportunities for everyone willing to work toward shared goals rather than individual dominance. Mapia himself had passed away 3 years earlier, his death marked by ceremonies that honored both his warrior heritage and his contributions to peaceful development. His final years had been spent teaching young people from all backgrounds the skills necessary for survival in a changing world, emphasizing the importance of adapting to new circumstances while maintaining connection to ancestral wisdom. School he had established continued to operate near their home, producing graduates who carried his philosophy of principled pragmatism into their own communities. The university dedication ceremony took place in an amphitheater carved into the hillside where Winona's Lodge had once provided refuge for the wounded and desperate. Students from across the continent had gathered to witness the formal opening of an institution that would offer degrees in everything from traditional medicine to advanced engineering, with curricula designed to honor indigenous knowledge while embracing beneficial innovations from around the world. The speakers included tribal elders, railroad executives, territorial governors, and international scholars who had come to study this unique experiment in educational cooperation. Thomas delivered the keynote address, his words carrying the authority of someone who had lived the principles he advocated rather than merely studying them in academic settings. He spoke of his adoptive parents' courage in choosing love over hatred during the territory's darkest period, describing how their example had inspired a generation of leaders who prioritized collaboration over conquest. His voice carried across the gathered crowd with the same quiet strength that had characterized his father's approach to seemingly impossible challenges. The rails that brought progress to this land were built with the labor of many hands and guided by the wisdom of many traditions, Thomas told the assembled audience, his words echoing off the canyon walls where ancient pictographs still recorded the struggles and triumphs of earlier peoples. But the most important foundation was laid not by steel and stone, but by individuals who chose to see beyond the boundaries that others accepted as permanent. Today we celebrate not just a new institution of learning, but the continuing legacy of those who dared to believe that former enemies could become family. Among the crowd, Abby noticed faces that told the story of the territory's transformation in human terms rather than abstract statistics. Former cavalry officers sat beside tribal warriors who had once fought them in bitter campaigns, their children now working together on engineering projects that would have seemed impossible to their parents' generation. The university's first graduating class included doctors trained in both European medical techniques and traditional healing methods, lawyers specializing in the complex legal frameworks that governed intercultural commerce, and teachers prepared to work in schools where multiple languages were considered assets rather than obstacles. The ceremony included the unveiling of a monument dedicated to all those who had died during the territory's violent transition period, acknowledging the suffering on all sides while committing to ensuring that such conflicts would not be repeated in future generations. The memorial's design incorporated elements from multiple artistic traditions, creating something that honored individual sacrifices while emphasizing shared humanity. Carved into its base were the names of people like Diego Ramirez and Jeremiah Wade, whose choices had led to destruction rather than creation, serving as reminders of paths that should never again be taken. As evening approached and the formal ceremonies concluded, Abby found herself walking alone through the ruins of the ancient settlement that had provided both inspiration and practical guidance for the territorial government's new policies. The archaeological site had been carefully preserved and developed into an outdoor museum where visitors could learn about the sophisticated civilization that had once flourished in this valley. The irrigation channels still carried water too. Gardens where traditional crops grew alongside imported varieties that had proven well suited to local conditions. The fruit trees that she and Mapia had planted during their early years together now formed mature groves that provided both sustenance and shade for travelers following the paths between the university and the nearby railroad depot. Their roots had grown deep into soil enriched by decades of careful cultivation, creating an ecosystem that supported far more life than the original prairie landscape, while maintaining the essential character that made this place special. Birds nested in the branches while deer grazed peacefully in clearings that had been designed to accommodate both human activities and wildlife needs. Thomas found her there as the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the transformation that had occurred in this land over the past quarter century. Mother and son stood together in comfortable silence, each lost in memories of the man whose vision had made their current happiness possible. The evening air carried the sounds of the modern world train whistles announcing arrivals and departures, children's laughter from the university dormitories, the distant music of a celebration that included traditional songs from multiple cultures. "He would have been proud of what we've accomplished," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the mix of satisfaction and sorrow that comes with achieving goals at the cost of losing those who inspired them. Not just the university or the railroad, or even the political changes, but the way people have learned to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of hostile groups. That was always his greatest dream, that children would grow up in a world where their parents' wars seemed as ancient and irrelevant as stories from books. Abby nodded, remembering the countless conversations she had shared with Mapia about the kind of future they hoped to create through their daily choices and long-term commitments. He had possessed an almost mystical faith in the power of individual actions to create ripple effects that would eventually transform entire societies, believing that every act of kindness or courage contributed to a larger pattern of positive change that would outlast any single lifetime. Their love story had become part of that pattern, demonstrating that the deepest human connections could transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and prejudice sought to maintain. The railroad depot visible in the distance now served communities that extended far beyond the original settlement boundaries, connecting farmers, ranchers, miners, and traders who represented dozens of different cultural backgrounds, united by shared economic interests and mutual respect. The trains that stopped there carried goods produced through cooperative ventures that had proven more profitable than competitive enterprises, while passenger services linked families separated by distance but united by bonds stronger than geography. As they prepared to return to the university for the evening's cultural presentations, Abby reflected on the letter she had received that morning from a young woman in California who was organizing similar cooperative development projects in communities, dealing with their own versions of intercultural conflict. The territorial model had begun to inspire imitators across the continent and even internationally, suggesting that the principles discovered through trial and error in this remote corner of Nebraska might have universal applications. The evenings entertainment featured performances that would have been impossible during the early days of territorial development, when cultural exchange occurred primarily through violence rather than celebration. Lakota singers shared the stage with Irish musicians, Mexican dancers performed alongside Swedish folk artists, and children from the university's preparatory school presented a theatrical piece that retold the story of the railroad's construction from multiple perspectives. The audience responded with enthusiasm that transcended cultural boundaries, recognizing universal themes of struggle, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph. Among the performers was a group of elderly women who had been present during the territory's most violent period, survivors who could remember when the sight of people from different backgrounds sharing the same space would have triggered immediate conflict. Their testimonies, recorded earlier that day for the university's oral history project, provided first-hand accounts of the transformation they had witnessed and the personal costs that progress had demanded from individuals on all sides of the original conflicts. The final presentation of the evening came from a delegation of students who had spent the summer working on archaeological projects at sites throughout the region, uncovering evidence of the complex interactions between different peoples that had characterized the area's history long before European settlement. Their findings challenged many assumptions about the nature of pre-contact civilizations while providing practical insights into sustainable land management techniques that were being incorporated into current agricultural and mining operations. As the formal program concluded and people began to drift away toward their various accommodations, Abby found herself in conversation with a group of international observers who had come to study the territorial model for potential application in their own countries. Representatives from Canada, Mexico, Australia, and even distant nations like South Africa and India expressed interest in adapting the collaborative frameworks that had emerged from the railroad project to address their own challenges with cultural diversity and resource development. The questions they asked revealed both the successes and limitations of what had been accomplished in the territory, forcing Abby to acknowledge that the progress achieved had come at considerable cost and remained fragile in the face of ongoing pressures from those who preferred simpler solutions to complex problems. The model required constant vigilance and renewal, demanding that each generation rediscover the principles that had guided their predecessors while adapting them to new circumstances and challenges. Walking back to her hotel through streets illuminated by electric lights powered by the territory's innovative hydroelectric system, Abby encountered reminders of how much had changed since that desperate morning when she had awakened tied to railroad tracks with her shoulder bearing the brand of a traitor. The same rails that had once threatened her destruction now carried prosperity and connection throughout a region that had become a beacon of hope for those seeking alternatives to the cycles of violence that seemed to characterize so much of human history. In her hotel room, she composed a letter to the young organizer in California, sharing insights gained through decades of practical experience with collaborative development, while encouraging her correspondent to trust in the power of persistent effort guided by principled vision. The letter became part of a correspondence network that was spreading the territorial model's influence far beyond its original boundaries, creating connections between communities that might never have communicated without the inspiration provided by successful examples of intercultural cooperation. As she prepared for sleep, Abby's final thoughts turned to the morning ahead, when she would board the eastbound train for the journey back to her home near the ancient settlement where she and Mappia had built their life together. The house they had constructed remained a gathering place for visitors, seeking to understand how former enemies had become family, while the gardens they had planted continued to provide both beauty and sustenance for all who needed them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would also offer fresh chances to prove that love could indeed triumph over hatred, when people possessed the courage to choose hope over fear.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.